just want to say welcome to everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that the Native Americans once lived in the land that we're living on now. They seeded, they nurtured, and they revitalized the land, and we're living here now. They lived here sustainably. We have a lot to learn from them. Okay. I'd like to acknowledge also the funding that we received from the Del Mar Foundation. They were very generous, and we've also had people from our community that have donated money for our events, and we're really grateful. As you know, there's so much climate science going on right now that our lives are becoming more and more aware of what we can do and how we can do it. One thing that we're doing with our symposiums here is trying to teach you what we can do as volunteers in our community. And one really nice piece of information to share with you is that Ashley Jones, our city manager, has asked us to continue these events. So we're going to be doing that probably every 6 months. So we'll be, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have a great committee that we've worked with. We have many volunteers. We have nonprofits who have endorsed us, and we're really thankful. We have a really action-packed evening of wonderful science from local authorities in the field, and we're really grateful to have them. There'll be a question and answer period along with a panel discussion after the 3 talks, and then an inspiration following that. Also, if you have time afterwards, come and look at the artwork that Tanya Young, another one of our residents, has created. She's quite an artist. Yeah. You can read about her also in our program. Shirley King, another one of our committee members, has created a poster outside that gives you all kinds of ideas on how you can volunteer. And you can even take a picture of it with your camera and think about where you might fit in and what feels more comfortable to you. Okay, so let's get started. Tonight, our Master of Ceremonies is Jonathan Applebaum. You might know him, you might recognize him from our first event in November. He spoke a couple of times really eloquently. He's a conservation biologist. He works with the San Diego River Valley Conservancy as a consultant, and also he's a board member of the Volcan Mountain Foundation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan as our Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you. Thank you. Very excited to be here today. We have a great lineup of speakers for you. It is truly an incredible assortment of experts in their fields. We have Dr. Alexander Sasha Gershunov, Dr. Jennifer Smith, Ann Middleton, and Mayela Manasjan. Between Ann and Mayela will be that panel discussion when you'll get a chance to ask the first three speakers questions. With no further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Alexander Sasha Gershunov. Dr. Gershunov is a research meteorologist in the Department of Climate, Atmospheric Science and Physical Oceanography at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at UCSD. Dr. Sasha's research focus is on the interrelated aspects of weather, climate, and society. His professional research interests include understanding the links between climate prediction, long-range climate prediction, regional weather extremes, and large-scale climate variability. He also studies climate's influence on society, as well as society's influence on climate. He holds a bachelor's in mathematics from UC Irvine and a master's of probability and statistics and a doctorate of geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, go Gauchos. And he has authored over 80 peer-reviewed papers and other documents for policymakers and members of the public. Please welcome Dr. Sasha Gershunov.
Yeah, my name is Sasha is a nickname for Alexander, where I come from, and where they speak like this, a very large and aggressive country. And if I tell you that I'm from the center of evil in the modern world, you can guess the city I'm from. But I've been in California since I was 12 years old, and really I'm a Californian. I'm a meteorologist and a statistician by training. You all know what a meteorologist is, but for those of you who don't know what a statistician is, it's somebody who doesn't have enough personality to become an accountant. But that's exactly what makes me a climatologist, though, because climate is the statistics of weather. So what I study, what I like to study, are regional weather patterns and weather extremes and how they're related to climate variability and climate change, how to use those relationships to understand and predict the kind of weather events that we care about, that we can actually feel. And I like to also study the impacts of extremes, like, with other experts in other fields. And so by contributing to these studies, interdisciplinary studies, I love to learn about things like epidemiology, water resource management, ecosystem management, and so on. And I was asked to talk about a few different extremes, but because the time is short, I'm just going to talk about precipitation extremes. Atmospheric rivers, but I'm going to try to put them in the context of our hydroclimate for you. And this is the group that I work with. We call ourselves WeClima, weather impacts, weather extremes and climate impacts analytics. We study, all these different weather patterns and their extreme manifestations. And I'm just going to talk about the stuff that's in red, but in the Q&A, you can ask me anything from that list. So that's what some of these things look like that we study. Let's see if this actually works. No, it doesn't work on the screen, of course. But that's okay, because you all know, where the drought is, where the flood is, on the where the wildfire and extreme weather and the heat wave over Paris and so on. Anyways, these are the kind of things that we really care about, and want to try to understand how they're related to climate variability and climate change. And so I'm going to focus on our precipitation regime, which is really the crux of the hydroclimate here, and try to convey to you how variable, how volatile it is, and how it really depends on extreme events. And so this map on the left shows the count of extreme precipitation events that are basically precipitation accumulations, rainfall accumulations of 15 inches or more in 3 days or less. And you can see it doesn't happen all over the country. There are stations that experience these events. This is actually, these accounts over about a 50-year observational period. So you can see that along the Gulf Coast, you have, counts of like 2, 3, 4 events in about 50 years. And these are related to, well, what do you think? What kind of hurricanes? Yeah, what kind of weather patterns? Yeah, hurricanes. But in California, we have more than our share of events like that. We don't get hurricanes here typically. And those are related to atmospheric rivers that we're going to talk about in detail. And you can see, you can note how those events are really tethered to the mountain ranges of California. And that's going to be an important point too, that we'll come back to. And that's what one of those events looks like in Northern California on the Yuba River. So here is a picture of how variable our climate is, hydroclimate is. And so if you look at the eastern part of the United States, you see that at those stations, it's pink, right? And pink means between 0.1 and 0.2. That is basically the ratio between the standard deviation, or measure of how variable total annual precipitation is from year to year, divided by what the climatological or average expected total at every station is, right? So 0.1 to 0.2 means between 10 and 20% of our normal precipitation is what we get in terms of variability year to year. So it's not very much, you know, it's pretty, the hydroclimate there is very stable. You know, we get this variability around the mean that's within like 10 to 20% of the mean. If you go into the Great Plains, you know, you get 20 to 30% around the mean. When we get to California, we get Northern California, 30 to 40%, Southern California, 40 to 50%. The desert is, you know, more than 50% variability around the mean. And that's a lot. That basically means, you know, we very rarely get our average precipitation in any particular year. It's either very deficient or extremely wet. And here, the black line shows kind of a smooth version of what our total annual precipitation looks like. This is actually for Northern California. And in the red line, that shows the variability of the upper 5% of the precipitation accumulations from the wettest 5% of days, of precipitating days. So you can see how closely the red and the black lines track, right? And this basically tells us that those heavy and extreme precipitation events really determine that interannual and longer-term variability of our hydroclimate. And everything else, you know, below 90, like everything else below the 95th percentile, in terms of, you know, more average kind of precipitation events, that's, they contribute that green line. And, you know, that's a lot of precipitation too, but that's not what the variability depends on. The variability really depends on the extreme events in this part of the world. And when we think about what we would expect, you know, with climate change as the world continues to warm, this is the picture for around the world. And the green areas basically represent an increase in precipitation. This is taking about 30 global climate models, forcing them with projected emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And then comparing the precipitation, the average annual precipitation in the second half of this century compared to average annual precipitation in the second half of the previous century, right? So these are the changes that we expect to see according to climate modeling. And then the black dots show places where 2/3 of the models agree on the sign of the change. So that's where we have confidence in the changes that are shown here. And you can see that most of the world actually is expected to experience an increase in precipitation, and that's because in a warmer world, we have more evaporation, and a warmer atmosphere is more capable of can hold more water vapor, and so when those when precipitation occurs, and especially extreme events, more water vapor is available, and you get more extreme precipitation. And so that happens along the equator. It happens in the high latitudes, where most of the warming is actually occurring and is projected to occur. You can see that the red areas are very special. And there are only a few of them around the world, and those are the ones where we expect to see a decrease in total annual precipitation. And you can see, the Mediterranean basin, the Western Cape of South Africa, parts of Australia and Chile. And these are all areas that wine grapes love to thrive in. They're Mediterranean climate regions. Mediterranean climate regions basically sit between the subtropics and the mid-latitudes, and so they have the subtropical climate in the summertime and mid-latitude climate, mid-latitude storms in the wintertime. They're wet in the winter and they're dry in the summer. And we're certainly in that climate regime here in California, but that's the only one Mediterranean climate region on this map where you don't see a decrease in precipitation. So why is California so different according to these climate models? Well, let's look a little bit deeper into that. We did a study some years back, a few years ago, where we looked at these 5 main Mediterranean climate regions around the globe, and you can see that all of them are projected to dry from the equatorward side, where we know that the subtropical subsidence, the subtropics are basically expanding expanding poleward, and pushing out mid-latitude storms, especially in the spring and fall, you can see that in all these regions, including California too. But in California, you don't really see that decrease. And if you look at the climate models, the spread of the climate models, they all pretty much go dry in all these other Mediterranean climate regions. But in California, some models go wet, and some models project drier conditions. So what's going on here? Can we really say anything about what we expect our precipitation to do in the future? So precipitation, unlike temperature, is an episodic variable. It either rains or it doesn't. And so we really need to look at both the frequency and the intensity of precipitation to get at the bottom of this. And so this is exactly what this graph shows. So on the left, you have the frequency of dry days, and then the rest is basically right next to dry days. It's the frequency of days below the 10th percentile, so like 10% of the drizzly days, right? And then as you go further along the x-axis, you just get to more and more intense precipitation. And you can see that the frequency of dry days basically increases in all of these regions, and the frequency of wet days decreases until you get to heavy and extreme precipitation. So above the 90th percentile, you see that California has an increase in those heavy precipitation days. And if you go above the 99th percentile, that's like 1% of the wettest days, extreme precipitation, we have more than a twofold increase projected for California. So basically, what we're seeing, and there's also an increase projected for the Mediterranean basin. And not much of a change for the other regions. But basically, for all these regions, the frequency of precipitation is projected to decrease, but the intensity, especially in California, is projected to increase, or at least not change for some of the other regions, especially the southern hemispheric regions. Their intensity is not projected to change, but with a decrease in frequency in the less extreme or kind of run-of-the-mill precipitation events, you basically have a future regime where our water resources depend more and more on heavy and extreme precipitation, especially in California. So really in California, it's this competition between two very high confidence signals, a decrease in precipitation frequency, more dry days, and an increase in precipitation intensity, so more extreme events. And depending on which one of the two signals wins out, the models for California go either wet or dry. But all of the models contain those two signals. Less frequent, but more intense precipitation. So what kind of storms produce the most extreme precipitation and flooding around here? Well, these are the atmospheric rivers, and at Scripps, we have a center devoted to the study of atmospheric rivers. It's called the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, and the director, sort of the godfather of atmospheric river research, Marty Ralph, lives right down the street from here. This is a picture of water vapor in the atmosphere. It's just a snapshot. It's a satellite image of how much water vapor is contained in the atmosphere. And you can see, this is for a particular day, but it's very consistent with the picture that you see most days, and the fact that most of the precipitation, most of the water vapor is in the tropics. That's where the trade winds converge, evaporate water vapor from the oceans and converge it towards the meteorological equator, which I cannot point out, but you can see where it is, right? That's where we have a lot of deep convection, a lot of the moisture and energy transported from the ocean into the atmosphere. And then if you look in the mid-latitudes, there are these filaments of very wet atmospheric conditions, these thin ephemeral filaments, and these are the atmospheric rivers. So these are wet and windy conditions. They're basically jets of very moist air that export that tropical moisture to the higher latitudes. And at any particular time around the globe, you may have, between 3 to 7 of these atmospheric rivers. They cover about 10% of the mid-latitude ocean area at any particular time on average, but they are responsible for 90% of the moisture transport from the tropics to the higher latitudes. They don't rain out all that much over the ocean, because these are stable conditions. They're jets of moist air. They're basically rivers in the sky, but it's water vapor, so it's water in the gas phase. And when an atmospheric river makes landfall, like that one that's making landfall on the coast of California right there, you know, and especially the coast of California that has mountain ranges that are perpendicular to that flow, that moist flow is forced to rise over the mountains. That moist air cools, and basically clouds form, and then precipitation precipitation occurs. It's very orographic, so it's really tethered to the mountains. And these are the events that, you know, these are not the most common storms, but they contribute close to half of our annual precipitation, especially in Northern California and along the mountain ranges. You can see both Sierra Nevada and the transverse ranges of Southern California. This is what an atmospheric river looks like. Basically, just like I said, you know, the moisture is carried from the ocean onto the land, and these very special coastlines, mountainous coastlines, like the coast of California and the coast of Chile, they get a lot of precipitation from these storms. And by the way, often there are these conditions when an atmospheric river is dumping a lot of rain and snow on the west side of the on the windward side of the mountain ranges, and on the crests, and then there's a downslope flow that warms and accelerates on its way down, and you can actually have wildfires on the other side. It can happen. Yeah, that's our climate. Here's what a couple of recent atmospheric rivers look like. That were actually extreme and produced floods. And I'm going to show you. So these are really rivers in the sky, but you know the riverbed is ephemeral, and they last, you know, a few days, typically. An average atmospheric river carries instantaneously about as much moisture as 3 Amazon rivers carry liquid water, on average, right? So this is a lot. This is like 20 Mississippi rivers on average, but water vapor. And that's what an atmospheric river impact looks like in the Russian River, which is a region of Northern California where, you know, that gets often gets floods from these events. So here's that, let's see, late February event on the right. You see how it slams right into Northern California? That's what the Russian River looked like from Guerneville in Sonoma Valley at the start of that event, okay? And then next day, exactly from the same point, you see how the river swells. And here's the third day. I'll just go back again, okay? Beginning, okay? Second day, third day. Not surprisingly, most of the floods, the vast majority of flood damages, that's what's shown in that inset, by the way. It's the proportion of flood damages that are due to atmospheric rivers specifically. You can see in Northern California it's 99%. In Southern California, it's 82%. It's the lion's share. Of course, as you go inland and past the mountains, it gets to be a lot less. But actually, in Arizona, you still have a lot. And those are the atmospheric rivers that make landfall in Baja California and make it up into Arizona. So what we were interested in finding out is what do the climate models, you know, that are projecting an increase in precipitation intensity, as I've shown you, what do they project specifically for atmospheric rivers? Because that's where we get the most intense storms. And here's that picture. It's about 16 global climate models that provide the data necessary to actually detect atmospheric river landfalls at the coast of the west coast of North America. Let's not worry about what these different colored lines mean, because pretty much all of the models show that right around now, in the early 21st century, we start seeing a trend in the intensity of the amount of water vapor that's transported by landfalling atmospheric rivers that make landfall at the west coast of North America. That's from 20 north to 60 north. And then the black line actually shows the observations. So you can see that the models tend to be a little too wet in general, and also that the observations don't really show a trend yet, but we would expect that atmospheric rivers would become more intense. Not only that, I'm not showing you the other variables. You know, this is the peak intensity in terms of water vapor transport in atmospheric rivers as we go into the future, into a warmer future, I should say. You know, the other variables like frequency of atmospheric rivers and average intensity and so on, they also increase. But the peak intensity is what's related to those most extreme storms. Again, just to remind you, you know, of this inset here is the contribution of atmospheric rivers to total annual precipitation. That's from observations. That's what the models show. You can see a really good correspondence there, right? You know, so on the left is the contribution of atmospheric rivers to total annual precipitation in the observational period. So that's the second half of the 20th century. In the middle is what we expect to see in terms of AR contribution to total annual precipitation, second half of this century. And on the right is the difference. So what we see is, specifically in California, we expect to see a much larger contribution of atmospheric rivers to our total annual precipitation. And if we look at these different river basins along the west coast here, from the Pacific Northwest and Northern California and Southern California, these are all flood-prone rivers, by the way. Where we repeated the same analysis that I showed you before for Mediterranean regions, but you know, that's for those specific river basins. Everywhere you see the same trend. You know, in those black dots, you see a decrease in sort of run-of-the-mill precipitation event frequencies, but an increase in the most intense precipitation events. And then the darker shaded bars show the contribution of atmospheric rivers specifically, and the lighter shaded bars are non-atmospheric river storms, other storms. And you can see basically that the decrease in the precipitation frequency is due to the other storms, whereas the increase in precipitation intensity is due to atmospheric rivers almost entirely. And that actually makes plenty of sense. You know, this is not a surprise result, but it just validates the physical thinking, the thermodynamic thinking about what should happen in a warmer atmosphere. You know, atmospheric rivers are near saturated events, features where the air is at close to 100% relative humidity, close to saturation. And the warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor at saturation. Actually, for every degree Celsius warming, the capacity of the air to contain water vapor increases 7%. So it's very, what the models show is very consistent with simple physical arguments. And that's why all of the models basically show an increase in precipitation from extreme atmospheric rivers. So what does that mean for our volatile hydroclimate? I'm just reminding you of what it looks like. That's the picture that I started with. Basically, you know, a lot of, you know, we have a very volatile climate in terms of how much variability there is around the expected amount of annual precipitation. So this is the same result, but from the climate models now. Again, on the left is the observational period, the future period in the middle, and the difference on the right. And what you see is basically a projected increase in our hydroclimate variability. So even though the models do not show a clear signal in how much total annual precipitation we should expect in the future, what we do see is that more of that is going to come from extreme atmospheric rivers. And that means that more of the total annual precipitation depends on those, you know, 2, 3, 4 big events every year, whether we get them or not, even more than it does now. And so that really spells even an increase or a more volatile hydroclimate in the future. And you can see how, especially in California, that is the case. So, you know, that kind of summarizes what we expect. I will not go through all of these points, but basically less frequent but more extreme precipitation means more variability in our hydroclimate. It also means, you know, that there will be other impacts associated with this. When we understand what kinds of storms are responsible for the changes that we expect, we can understand more about the details of hydroclimate changes that we would expect. So atmospheric rivers are already warmer storms than other winter storms. Warmer storms have higher snow lines. As they're warming, of course, the snow lines also increase. And we can see that already over the last few decades in observations. That's a result of the warming. So as the snow lines increase, you have more liquid precipitation that runs off during the winter when we don't really need it that much, and less that stays on, you know, and more confined to the top of the mountains as snowpack. Here's a picture of what the volatility of our hydroclimate looks like now. You know, so on the right is Oroville Dam, you know, basically almost overflowing in February of 2017 from a series of atmospheric rivers. And then a few years later, in the summer, it's down to its lowest ever level, so low that it was impossible to operate the electric plant, the hydroelectric plant. This is a atmospheric rivers globe. If you come to Scripps, I'll be happy to show it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gershunov. That was eye-opening, to put it mildly. Next up for us this evening is Dr. Jennifer Smith. Dr. Smith is professor of marine ecology and conservation at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at Scripps Institute of Oceanography at UCSD. Dr. Smith's research focus is on the understanding of the factors that influence community structure in marine ecosystems. Her research goes beyond basic ecology by integrating conservation, restoration, and sustainability to ensure effective management of marine ecosystems. Her lab members are increasingly interested in seafood sustainability, coastal aquaculture, and habitat restoration. Her primary interests lie in determining how different human impacts affect coral reefs and locally, local kelp forests. She is focused on investigating the impacts of overfishing, pollution, climate change, and ocean acidification, and species invasions on marine communities. The results of this work are critical to effective management, conservation, and restoration of marine ecosystems around the globe. She received dual bachelor's degrees in zoology and biology from Humboldt State University and a PhD from the University of Hawaii. So with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Jennifer Smith.
Well, good evening. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation to share some of the work that my lab has been doing at Scripps Oceanography just down the road. As mentioned, I'm a marine ecologist. My lab hosts a number of graduate students, PhD students, and master's students and undergrads, where we are fundamentally interested in trying to understand the structure of the communities that lie just right offshore in our underwater realm. And we're very interested in trying to understand some of the largest impacts to these ecosystems, which unfortunately right now are all in the hands of climate change. For those of you who may not have had the pleasure of immersing yourself underwater in these habitats, these are our kelp forests, and they exist just off the shore. Perhaps some of you who have lived here for a long time might remember seeing a lot more of them than we see now. You can see the surface canopy from shore, and a lot of that has been decreasing over time. So I'm going to give you just an overview of kind of kelp forest ecology, the ecosystems we have offshore, some of the work that my lab is really just getting up and running right now, and talk about some restoration and potential climate solutions. So if you go offshore right here in San Diego, you will find kelp forests that exist pretty much from Oceanside, patchily through North County, pretty much anywhere where there's rocky reef habitat, so hard bottom, they can't grow on sand, through to right here off Del Mar, kind of in patchy little islands. And then when you get to La Jolla, we have had historically a continuous kelp forest population from just inside La Jolla Cove to kind of in South La Jolla off of Bird Rock. And then if you go further south down into Point Loma, we have historically had one of the largest continuous kelp forests in all of California, pretty much ranging across the whole coast of Point Loma, and then a bit of a break, and then some more kelp forest habitat off of Imperial Beach. So what are these ecosystems? They are dominated by kelp, which are essentially the underwater trees of our marine environments. Although kelp are not true plants, they're known as seaweeds. They belong to a specific taxonomic group known as the order Laminariales that contain over 100 species of similar large brown habitat-forming seaweeds that pretty much grow in cold, temperate waters across the globe. As I mentioned, they are dependent on having hard bottom substrates, so anywhere where you have rocky reef, you're likely to find a kelp forest habitat. And these individual species of seaweed, they form these dense stands that create this incredibly complex ecosystem in a space that would otherwise just be open water. And so they create all this structure and complexity. It's like going into a redwood forest, right? If you didn't have those redwood trees, you wouldn't have the habitat for all the birds and the insects and all the other species of plants that live within that ecosystem. And this just gives you a little conceptual diagram of kind of a typical kelp forest where you have different types of habitats as you move from shallow water environments where you might have certain species of seaweed dominating, and then into deeper water habitats where you have these true canopy forming species of giant kelp known as Macrocystis pyrifera. That is our king or queen, if you will, of the seaweed world that really does create these iconic ecosystems, providing habitat for all kinds of different invertebrates, fish species, and many other species of seaweed. So how do these seaweeds build these ecosystems? The giant kelp, specifically Macrocystis pyrifera, is the fastest growing multicellular organism in the ocean. It can grow up to 2 feet per day. You could practically see it growing with your naked eye. I always like to remind my students it's about 0.0002 miles per hour, which for a plant is pretty fast, or for a photosynthetic organism. And it can reach sizes up to 100 feet in length. And they grow from the bottom where they're attached to the rocky reef. They send up these branches that grow towards the surface. They have these beautiful growing meristems at the very tip. This is known as a scimitar blade. They make amazing art. And then when this branch reaches the surface, it creates this massive canopy that lines the surface of the ocean. Again, as I mentioned, these form these really complex habitats that are very important for our offshore marine ecosystems from an ecological perspective. We consider them a foundation species or an ecosystem engineer. They are living organisms that engineer habitat. It's like building a city, but the structure is actually alive. And they provide habitat and shelter for all of these charismatic species, including our California state fish, the Garibaldi, supporting one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the ocean, aside from perhaps tropical coral reefs. In the temperate or cold water environments, our kelp forests are these biodiversity hotspots. The kelp themselves are also the base of the food web, meaning any organism that's a vegetarian in the ocean is going to rely on eating seaweed like giant kelp to get their nutrition. So they fix carbon really rapidly. They can also be seen as a form of potential carbon sequestration and blue carbon. That because the kelp grows all the way up to the surface, the kelp forests dampen the forces of wave energy and actually reduce coastal erosion when that canopy is intact. Economically, here in San Diego, our kelp forests support a huge amount of revenue generation in support of recreational fishing. So many of you might enjoy recreational fishing, whether it be hook and line, spear fishing, or using simple traps to catch things like sheephead, kelp bass, sea urchins, and our iconic spiny lobster. These ecosystems also support a number of relatively small scale, but commercial fisheries as well. Specifically, sea urchins is one of the big ones, as well as spiny lobsters, and some of our rockfish are all found within kelp forest habitats. They also are really important for tourism, so many people are willing to spend money to spend time visiting these kelp forests, whether it be free diving, scuba diving, kayaking, or interacting with them from the land in aquariums such as the Birch Aquarium, where we have a wonderful kelp exhibit there where you can learn more about these iconic ecosystems without having to get wet. They're also really important for our health and well-being. Seaweeds provide or are an incredibly nutritious form of potential food for people, although we don't consume it nearly enough. It's the ultimate superfood. It has more vitamins and minerals than anything we can grow on land by an order of magnitude. It's also really important for surfers, as I mentioned, because the kelp breaks up wind chop. Surfers know, I'm sure many of you in here, the waves are always better on the inside of a kelp bed because it glasses off the surface of the water. Also really wonderful form of art. We have a number of local artists that use kelp for their primary media, such as Oriana Poindexter, who does these wonderful cyanotypes. I do my own seaweed art when I have free time outside of my teaching and mentoring, and so they're just an incredibly important resource. So where do we find them? I mentioned that they're typically found anywhere where you have cold water and hard bottom substrates. So if you look at the global distribution of kelp forests, we pretty much see what's known as an anti-tropical distribution. Anywhere that's not warm tropical water, you're going to find kelp forest habitat in North America, from pretty much Baja California all the way up through Alaska, South America, the North Atlantic, et cetera. If you, again, look at this and compare it to some oceanographic parameters, you'll note that we typically find, again, kelp forests in cold water. This graph is showing chlorophyll concentration, and chlorophyll concentration is actually a proxy for the amount of nitrogen in the water. So wherever we have cold water, we typically have upwelling, which means that there's cold, nutrient-rich water being driven up to the surface. So this is associated with surface winds pushing water offshore, which pulls this deeper, cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface. Nutrient-rich water, you can imagine, a plant that grows 2 feet a day is going to need a lot of nitrogen, right? And so these are the kind of two fundamental building blocks for happy, healthy kelp forests, is having cold water with lots of nutrients, specifically nitrogen, having hard rocky substrates, having habitats that have enough sunlight for them to grow. So you can imagine these kelp forests have evolved in some pretty specific conditions. Cold, nutrient-rich water are the primary ones. And you can also imagine that we as humans, with our greenhouse gas emission addiction problem and the driving of changes in sea surface temperature and global climate change, that causes seawater to become warmer. And so this is one of our over 100-year time series right off the Scripps Pier. We have the longest sea surface temperature time series in existence, where we've taken water samples every single day since back in the early 1900s. And we've been able to detect, variability, because we are in a coastal upwelling system that does have a lot of variability. But over time, you can see there's a trend of increasing sea surface temperature. And back in 2018, we actually recorded temperatures of up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit off the Scripps Pier during the summer. So this was during one of those marine heat waves, where it was basically Hawaii temperatures in San Diego. It was unbelievable. And of course, thinking about the global trends, we've seen a much clearer overall global trend in the increases in average temperature. This isn't sea surface temperature, but we can expect to see the oceans continuing to increase in temperature. In association with just general increases in temperature, we see these anomalies where you get warm water shown in red moving across the Pacific during certain years. These were both El Nino years, where we had a change in ocean circulation. It pretty much shut down our upwelling system and brought warmer, low nutrient water into our coastal ecosystem, and that has been a big problem for kelp forests. So let's take a look at our local kelp forests, all these dots. So the gray area indicates areas that were historic kelp populations, and all the blue dots indicate current kelp forest populations. So we're just comparing 2013 to 2023. Oh, it's supposed to be an animation. Oh, it's not gonna work. Strange. Anyway, if we were to, this video did go along the entire coast of San Diego, but the bottom line is that there are a lot fewer of these blue dots relative to the historic footprint that existed now than there were a decade ago. And so we're really interested in trying to understand, okay, A, why has kelp loss occurred in some places and not others? And B, we've seen after the last large El Nino back in 2014, 2015, we've seen kelp recovery in some areas, but not in others. And so we're really interested in trying to understand why some locations are seeing recovery and others aren't. And to do that, we are having to think of a whole bunch of different things. So you may have heard about kelp forest degradation before, and what comes to mind perhaps is these sea urchin barrens. Sea urchin barrens, sea urchins are the primary consumer of giant kelp, and sometimes their populations can get out of hand and they will essentially decimate the entire kelp forest population of kelp itself, consuming everything down to nothing and leaving it into this like alternate stable state. Typically, these sea urchin explosions are due to a number of things. Overfishing of their primary predators, so things like sheephead, sea otters up in Northern California, and these giant sea stars, known as the sunflower sea stars, they all consume urchins. Historically, we were used to seeing these urchin barrens occurring pretty much just in response to overfishing. So we take away the urchin predators, the urchins explode in population, and they eat all the kelp, and then the kelp essentially gets stuck in this very low abundance state. But most recently, in association with this last big El Nino event, we saw something different, and this was when we had that thing called the blob, which you may remember. And up in Northern California, the sea stars were incredibly prevalent, and they were kind of the keystone predator of sea urchins. The blob resulted in a widespread disease outbreak for these sea stars called the sea star wasting disease. You can essentially see the sea star just melting, and essentially the entire population of sea stars from essentially Central California all the way through Oregon and Washington died from this disease. And subsequently, we saw an outbreak of urchins that was perhaps pretty much one of the most widespread urchin epidemics we've seen, such that in Central and Northern California, the kelp populations were stuck in this completely wiped out status. And that led people to coming up with all kinds of creative ways of trying to address the urchins. You might think that when the urchins run out of food, they'll eventually just die, right? But that's the thing about these sea urchins. They can live in what's considered a zombie state for months at a time where they're not feeding. They've reduced their metabolism down to next to nothing. They can slowly start digesting themselves, but they're not dead. And then new food comes in and they can start eating it. So they were doing a really good job of keeping the kelp clear and preventing natural recovery processes from occurring. So at that point in time, the only solutions were literally to go out and smash urchins with hammers. You can imagine that while that might be satisfying for some divers, if you're talking about probably hundreds of millions of urchins, we can have urchin densities of up to, over 50 per square meter, so that we're talking about a lot. And these things, if you've interacted with an urchin, they're not that friendly to touch or to get poked by, so fairly dangerous. So another option was to harvest them for the urchin fishery, but as I mentioned, if they're really in a zombie state, there's essentially no nutrition in there. We eat the urchin gonads if you've ever had uni, but if the urchins are starved, the uni is essentially nothing, and so they were pretty much worthless from a fisheries perspective. So other options are to restore the sea star population. There's a lot of activity actually just at Birch Aquarium. They have a sea star hatchery happening right now. And then the other option is to actually try to grow baby kelp and outplant those kelp plants. But of course, if the urchins are still there, that's going to be kind of a futile effort. So there's a lot of work going on in Northern California, in this Northern and Central California, trying to address the sea star issue. Here in San Diego and in Southern California, we didn't have the same issue. We have a lot of urchin predators, spiny lobster, things like sheephead and other species all consume urchin, and so we weren't reliant specifically on that sea star. Here in San Diego, our primary issue was that the kelp itself is at its southern end of its thermal boundary, right? Because we're kind of in the subtropical zone, so we're a lot warmer than Northern and Central California. So here, the temperature itself affected the kelp directly and kind of causes the kelp to melt and erode away when temperatures get too warm. So we have a research program right now in a collaboration with my lab and folks at Salk, UCLA, and the University of Tasmania. I've cultivated a wonderful group of students who are all really interested in asking a number of questions to try to help understand what's going on here in San Diego. Here, we're specifically interested in monitoring what's going on in the kelp forest right now and how it's changing over time, where kelp exists and where it's recovered, to try to address why some places have recovered and others haven't. We're out collecting kelp and doing the genetics on them to try to understand how much natural diversity exists in our populations. And then we're collecting kelp and we're exposing them to different temperatures to try to identify if we can determine temperature tolerance. So you imagine all of us in the room, some of us are going to be able to handle warm weather better than others. I know I don't do that great in warm weather. The same is true with these kelp kelp individuals. If we can find individual kelps that are more thermally tolerant than their neighbors, we can take those, grow them up in the lab, and then perhaps use them for experimental restoration, where we outplant them back into the field and try to see how they survive. And so right now, most of our work is focused in the La Jolla area because we have this really clear gradient of recovered kelp, and then up in northern La Jolla where the kelp has not recovered, we're out there underwater counting number of individuals of kelp and seeing how it changes over time. As I mentioned, we're collecting individuals for genetics, trying to determine how much population variability exists so that we can use that knowledge for perhaps future restoration. We do a whole bunch of experiments in the lab at Scripps. You guys are welcome to come for a tour where we manipulate temperature and we watch to see how different life stages of the kelp respond to these temperature stressors, ultimately to see if we can find, one or two individuals that have that greater thermal tolerance. We will be using them to settle onto tiles that we can then bring back out into the field, transplant them into places where the kelp has not recovered, and track their abundance and growth over time. This is largely underwater gardening. It might seem simple, but the field of kelp forest restoration is at its very, very beginning. And so there's a lot to learn on how we even go about doing this. You can learn more in this YouTube video, great coverage of one of my students. If you just Google, YouTube Scripps kelp forest restoration, you'll be able to find it. This work is largely in progress, so I don't have a ton of results to share with you today. Coincidentally, today is Triton Giving Day, which is a fundraising event at UC San Diego, and Scripps has highlighted our kelp forest restoration as one of the 3 projects that they're promoting for generating support for this work, so thank you. As I mentioned, I have a lot of students that are really excited about doing this work, and I try to kind of piecemeal funding together, so anything does really help to help support these students, and it's great that so many are interested in this work, and we have a lot of work to do. Just lastly, I'll leave you with some inspirational thoughts. Because we know climate change is among the largest threats to society today, and of course this is driven by greenhouse gas emissions, we tend to think less about methane because it's less abundant in the atmosphere, but methane is actually up to 30 times more potent in terms of its warming potential than CO2. The largest source of methane is the livestock industry, so why am I talking about cows as a seaweed person? Well, because we've basically found that there is a little red seaweed that when fed in very small quantities to ruminants can prevent methane emissions by up to 98%. This is another initiative that my lab is working on, essentially where we are trying to figure out ways of cultivating the seaweed to help inform the industry, to be able to get the seaweed into the hands of livestock farmers around the world. Ultimately, if we are able to do this, we can essentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 2.3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year, which is about 25% of the global transportation industry. So if you want to learn more about that, there's another YouTube video called Can Seaweed Save the Planet on the Scripps YouTube channel. I'd like to thank my wonderful lab, who is pictured here.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I'm so glad to know that your lab is on the job. And now we have my good friend, Ann Middleton from Wild Coast, here to discuss opportunities for participatory protection of our coastal resources. Ann was recently named Associate Director at Wild Coast, a nonprofit founded in 2000 to help protect some of the most ecologically important coastal wildlands, islands, and marine areas in California and Baja California. Ann is, again, the director at was director at EcoLife Conservation, a local nonprofit with a variety of local, regional, and binational initiatives in Mexico and the United States. She has previously worked with Sustainability Matters, a local green build firm, and before that with the San Diego County Water Authority. Ann has worked in such exotic places as Cameroon and DC. where she worked for the Environmental Investigation Agency, a nonprofit that investigates international wildlife crime and advocates for legislative solutions. EIA's investigations in Madagascar led to the first criminal case for the amended Lacey Act, a ban on illegal trade in illegal wood products. Anne has a bachelor's degree in biology from Oberlin College and a master's degree in environmental sciences and management from the Bren School at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Please welcome Anne Middleton.
All right, see if I can manage both of these at once. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All right, I have a background in theater, so talking loudly is never an issue for me. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jonathan. It's always nice to be around fellow gauchos. I don't have a PhD, so sometimes people say, what does MESM stand for? And it's the multidisciplinary program from which we came, so nice to be here in San Diego. So I know it's hard sometimes to come to these environmental presentations because it's like a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of really cool science, and I'm really, really glad that the two presenters ahead of us gave all the information that they gave. And you know, it's really inspirational for me to see what other people are doing out here. And in San Diego, and even specifically here in Del Mar, we have so many passionate, smart, hardworking people working to help understand and address these huge challenges. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about Wild Coast as an organization, particularly because we are here in Del Mar. Our headquarters is right down the street. And we're kind of new to Del Mar. We moved from Imperial Beach just about a couple years ago. And then I'll get more into specifically our Marine Protected Area Watch volunteer program. So if you want to do something different or something additional for helping us preserve our beautiful beaches, oceans, and coastlines here in Del Mar, I will give you more information about that. So Wild Coast is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to protect coastal and marine ecosystems through natural solutions. So does anyone know what we mean when we say protecting things with natural solutions? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, I know. So scientists in the room, yeah, maybe. So by natural solutions, we mean using existing ecosystem processes and ecosystem resilience and function to address things like climate change, like biodiversity loss. And Jennifer, thank you so much. You gave such an amazing example of what natural solutions look like in reality, like replanting kelp beds. So I'm going to briefly talk about our U.S. program and then come back to it because that's going to be the meat of my presentation. But we have several programs at Wild Coast. We're a binational organization. We have about 15 employees here in Del Mar, and then we've got about 17 employees throughout Mexico. Our U.S. Oceans program works to help manage and protect the marine protected areas throughout the state of California, which is what I'm going to be talking about later. Has anyone here heard about MPAs or marine protected areas? Okay, good. That'll make my job easier. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. Our marine debris program is based in Tijuana. And while we are actively involved in keeping like the poop pollution out of the water as well, it's the plastic and trash pollution that is featured here in this photo. This trash boom is something that we installed in one of the concrete canyons in Tijuana. And to date, we've collected over 200,000 pounds of trash from this one location, and we work with community members there as it's a source of employment for them to sort through that debris. What we can recycle, we do. What we can upcycle, we do. And the rest is sent to landfills. So if we are successful in our fundraising efforts this year, we hope to expand this program phenomenally and build 9 more booms within the Tijuana River watershed, because as we all know, ecosystems, watersheds do not respect international or political boundaries. So what happens in Tijuana happens in San Diego, right? That's what we're seeing with all the water and trash coming across the border. We actively work to restore and protect some of the wetlands here in San Diego, notably San Diego Lagoon, which is close by here. You can see it from the Viewpoint Brewery. That wasn't a plug. I actually really like their food, and it's a nice viewpoint. It has a nice view. We, historically in California, we have lost 90% of our wetlands. So for me, as a conservationist, as a biologist, that means that the remaining 10% are super, super important to protect, to restore, to understand the biodiversity. And much like seagrass habitats, they are important for not only for maintaining biodiversity and habitat, but also for helping us mitigate the effects of floods from these atmospheric rivers we're seeing. The wetlands are like sponges in our communities. So I hope you get to go visit Viewpoint Brewing and see our local wetland here. Our mangroves program, we're restoring and planting mangroves across areas of Mexico. We have wetlands here north in California, and mangroves are what we have in the tropical areas. And then we are working to protect areas where gray whales have their babies. I was just in Laguna San Ignacio in Baja a couple weeks ago, and it was just past the whale season, but I did get to plant some mangroves, so that was fun. I think this is our last few programs here. We do a lot at Wild Coast. We're a small but mighty organization. We work with, actually, the Mexican government when they work with us. It's really great. To establish protected areas where sea turtles have their babies. And there historically have been a lot of problems with sea turtles, one being light pollution, poaching for eggs, people eat them. We have feral dogs eating the eggs, and we are protecting the beaches where they're nesting and helping facilitate the birth of all of these baby turtles. If you want to come see that in real life, we take people there. It's they're called arribadas in Spanish, and it's usually around early November. And it's just, I've not been yet, so hopefully I get to go this year, but you get to help release the babies back to the water. In Baja, we do a lot of land acquisition too. So when we raise money specifically for this program, we are buying parcels in wild Baja. And you can see from this photo, this is what Baja California looked like before Trump Towers and all the other abandoned developments came in over Baja. So we're trying to prevent bad development. And so we get to protect these super wild areas. And then lastly, our coral reefs program is also super impacted by all of the weather things that you just heard about. When we have climate change coupled with El Nino, it creates these mass bleaching events. In fact, I think there was one in the headlines in NPR a couple weeks ago. I heard it on my way to work. So we are working to monitor these bleaching events, study them, see what's causing them, see how we can prevent them, understand what kind of corals are going to be more likely to survive in warmer temperatures, so mitigation, and then also restoration of these corals. So, in a nutshell, here are the areas where we work, and again, I feel so lucky to have our office right here in Del Mar. It's kind of our mothership where we're running a lot of these programs. But why I'm here today is to talk about marine protected areas. So it sounds like a handful of people in this room know what that is, but I'm going to go over it in detail and then talk more specifically about the MPA Watch program, which we manage for San Diego County, and how you can get involved should you choose to do so. So a marine protected area is a designated area of the ocean where human activities such as fishing, construction, et cetera, are limited or completely restricted. So think of them as underwater parks. And if you want to get super technical, part of the MPAs sometimes go into the land area as well. But for intents and purposes, they're underwater parks. And they're a safe haven for marine life, which helps our local fisheries when the marine life is healthier. And let's see if I have a map here. So I know you can't really see this very well, but these in San Diego County, here's a list of our marine protected areas. And if you look between, how am I going to use this? Never mind. Right in the middle there, it says San Diego Lagoon SMCA, and that's the one that's closest here to Del Mar. It's just south of that big bluish blob up there. Let's see, the MPA system was introduced to California as part of the Marine Life Protection Act in 1999, and there are 124 MPAs throughout California by 2012, and 11 of them are here in San Diego. I'm gonna skip over that. Thanks, Carol, for the land acknowledgement earlier. I just want to reiterate that we are here on Kumeyaay land, and yes, we hope to understand traditional ecological knowledge and bring that forward so that we continue to live in these beautiful spaces and live sustainably. So, MPA seems simple, but it's important to understand that when you have protected areas where they are no-take, and in the biology world, no-take means literally no-taking, so no fishing, no picking up rocks and shells, leave no trace, that whole ethic. And when you have no-take areas, it allows the individuals within that habitat to grow older, to be more effective reproductively, and to have bigger, more healthy babies, as you can see from this image here. So it's really hard to see where the boundaries are in a marine protected area when you're out on the water, but we have tools for that, which I'll get into in a minute. But when you're talking with fishermen, for example, I remember when I was at Bren in 2008, and I grew up in Montana, landlocked state, not really a seafood person. But a friend of mine was like, my friend's a lobster fisherman, you gotta come with us and eat some lobster. And we were actually discussing marine protected areas in one of our classes at that time. I was like, oh my gosh, a lobster fisherman, is he gonna like us? Is he going to want to be my friend? Conservation versus fishing. And really, in our experience, and in my experience in other resource management areas as well, when you're working closely with the people who are on the water or in the forest where they may be, seeing these resources disappear, it's kind of a no-brainer to do these kind of protective measures, because you will see over time with effective law enforcement and effective communication of the rules and why we're doing it, it helps increase the ability of resources for people who are taking the resources. So why I bring up the lobster fisherman story is I got to go on this lobster fisherman boat, and he told me at the time, unprompted, you know, since these MPAs have been established, I've actually seen bigger lobsters where I normally fish, which was outside the MPA. I was just like, oh my gosh, they're working, that's so great. The lobster was pretty tasty too. So back on to the science of how these things work. As you can see, if you have a single reserve, you've got this radius of the impacts of where that no-take area may be. Why the whole marine protected area network is important is you'll get those overlapping circles of protected habitat and increase the spillover effect. So when all 124 marine protected areas in California are effective, they're being enforced, it's going to benefit recreation and commercial fishing and the biodiversity upon which we all depend. And I kind of want to stick on that point for a second. I know there's a lot of scientists in the room, but for us who live and breathe this stuff, when we're talking about these existential crises like climate change and how it might impact the economy and the budget and the price of gas, the thing that's often, for me, left out of the conversation is, how is it gonna impact us and our way of life? And you don't have to be a tree hugger or a dolphin kisser or a sea kelp enthusiast to understand that we are very much part of the ecological systems in which we reside. And when they start to break down piece by piece, whether it's by flooding or you lose a kelp species or you lose a lobster species or there's disease in sea stars, those things have a trickle down or going up effect on the way that we all interact with our ecosystems, right? And we're no longer in a space where it's like, oh, we'll feel it in 10 years, we'll feel it in 20 years, we'll feel it in 50 years. It'll be a problem for my grandkids. It's now. So even here in Del Mar, when we're talking about some of the more controversial things like managed retreat, for example, these are climate issues. These are environmental issues that impact our way of life and our pocketbooks. And Sasha, while you were talking, the whole time I was sitting there thinking, man, you know what? If we had invested in climate and flooding infrastructure 20, 50 years ago, maybe we wouldn't be having these atmospheric river floods, or maybe when the flooding occurs, we wouldn't be having all of this infrastructure collapse like we've seen in the last few weeks here in San Diego, or months in San Diego. So Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but just say, like, I think it's important that we reframe some of these environmental issues as everybody issues, as people issues, as societal issues, as economic issues. And when we start looking through our lens of politics and economy with the lens of the environment and baking these things into the way that we go about our lives, we all win. We all win. So there are different types of MPAs that are indicated here by colors. Some of them are you're allowed to line fish. Some of them are allowed for recreational fishing. Some are allowed for commercial fishing. Some are, you can't do anything. So it kind of depends. And of course, it's a very collaborative, often heated process to decide how these regulations come about. You've got nonprofits like us, you've got civil society, you've got governments and commercial fisheries all working together to come up with a solution that makes the most sense for everybody. So when I was younger and decided I wanted to be a biologist and play in the forest and marine biology, being on a boat with whales, all of that is true, and I get to do all of that, and it's very fun, but it's the sausage is made in our world when you're doing the political regulation building like all of this. So it's really fun for me to be in a room full of people who understand that and participate in that, and please continue to do so. So with my last few minutes, I'm just going to talk briefly about the MPA Watch, which is the program that we run that helps to keep these MPAs, the data real for enforcement. So it's a program led by a group of nonprofits, which you can see here, all along the coast of California. And Wild Coast is the leader for here in San Diego. And we all train volunteers, just like you here, should you choose to participate, to count the number of people and activities happening on our beaches at any given time. And it's like a pretty extensive training. I mean, it's not hard, but you sit down and you come to something like this. I thought about doing it right now, but if you're not interested, it wouldn't be that exciting. But I'll kind of breeze through some of the things that would be in said training should you choose to participate. So we provide you with a little tracker sheet, basically, and you walk along a transect of a specific area in the MPA and just count the activities that you're seeing, whether it's fishing, surfing, poaching, and the data is critically important for enforcement actions, for us as a nonprofit watchdog organization, but also for the government. So we get data from these surveys, but we also ground truth it, and by ground truth it, I should probably say water truth it. So we have a couple of radar units also on our MPAs here in San Diego County, so we can see activity within the MPAs from the radar, and then we go out on a boat and we say, okay, well, this is what we've seen. We've seen trends like Friday morning at 9 a.m. There seem to be a couple of these commercial fishing boats that look like they're fishing in the MPA, and we record it, we report it to CalTIP, and we're actively working on getting more funding enforcement so that these things are less likely to happen. You can't see this very well, but we'll make these slides available. But this is some of the data that we get from our MPA watch volunteers, which is really useful. Let's see if I can show you something that's a little bit more exciting. So these are the boat-based surveys, too, that go along with our MPA watch reports. And all of these things are publicly available, too. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to send you the reports. But these are the type of activities that we monitor in MPA Watch. And the MPA Watch program, like I said, is throughout California. It's a standardized process. So we scientists like to standardize our data so we can compare it year over year. So these are all of the activities that people can observe while they're doing the MPA Watch. Here's some more. So simply put, we're just counting people on the beach. What are they doing? And with that, we can help make management decisions. We can help law enforcement, Fish and Wildlife say, you know, we're seeing a trend in potentially illegal activity at this time of day. We think you should station a warden in this area. And it helps us when we're talking with our elected officials, too, when they're working on budgets for the next funding cycle. So this is what the spreadsheet looks like that we hand you on a clipboard. We note other things for more sciencey stuff, like what's the precipitation, tide level, because sometimes that can influence behavior. So if you choose to sign up for MPA Watch, which is one of our many volunteer programs, we will go through a specific training with you. I'm not going to do that right now, but these are the things we go over. And I am sad to say that Lily Mulligan, who is our MPA Watch and MPA expert on board right now, I shouldn't say sad, she's in Fiji snorkeling, so that's why I'm here today. So, I guess we both win-win, but this is her contact information. So here's the MPA Watch website too. Like I said, it's anyone can log into the or can go visit this, but when you are a volunteer or you're a volunteer organization, you can log in and actually we enter all the data ourselves. And this is the things we'll teach you if you ever do the training, but that's what we do on our end. And I'm gonna stop there so we have extra time for the panel discussion. But I hope that if you're interested in participating in MPA Watch, please come find me, or you can get information from our website, because I know that there are a lot of things you do here in Del Mar to protect our oceans, and this is just another really fun way to just get out on the water and see what's going on. So thank you so much.
I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. One of the benefits of being the moderator. It is, to our panelists, given that the global climate crisis and global biodiversity crises are inextricably linked, what solutions can organizations like yours pursue, either individually or in collaboration with one another, to protect our coastal resources? What solutions can be implemented locally that are scalable to affect global impact?
Thinking from the global perspective first, we're never going to be able to get a handle on climate change until we actually decide that greenhouse gas emissions are something that we need to seriously regulate and change our entire outlook on our industry, our society, civilization. So I think everybody kind of knows that, but it's something that needs to be said. I think investing in solutions that have the opportunity to vastly reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're currently doing, such as the seaweed solution, that's just one example. There are many people at Scripps and at other institutions, organizations around the world that are looking at nature-based climate solutions. So how can we use the ocean that occupies 70% of the Earth's surface to try to absorb some of the CO2 and greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere and lock them away so that we can start seeing a change in our climate. Locally, everybody can do their own part in reducing their carbon footprint. And I think, investing in your local community, your local resources, supporting local farmers, supporting farm to table, ocean to table kind of opportunities where we're not spending our money to import food and resources that we use every day from China to here in San Diego, that will help reduce carbon footprints. I mean, this is obviously a soapbox I could go on, so I probably will step back, but supporting local efforts to do restoration, to build resilience into our local communities, to give them a chance to have a fighting chance in the future against climate change.
Okay, I'll add on to that. Thank you. I feel like I have a little bit more wiggle room as a resident nonprofit speaker up here, though. But, I think to echo what she said, every little thing we do matters, and sometimes you think it doesn't. And I think what matters most is talking to your friends and family about it, too. Like the things that you do to reduce your carbon consumption, your greenhouse gases. And that's the things you do to reduce your carbon use, but the things you do also to avoid using them. And a lot of that is with your dollars and how you vote, et cetera. But I think one of the things as an environmental advocate, one of the places where I think environmentalists went wrong is making the environment something that isn't about everybody, like I was saying before. It shouldn't be a wedge issue. It shouldn't be a political issue. It's an everybody issue. So please continue doing the little things that you're doing. And I know that by being here tonight, you are doing a lot of things in your household with your family, how you spend your time and how you spend your money, what you eat, how you get places. So just keep doing that. Don't give up. And everything you can do to convince your friends and family to do the same, it really does matter.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, I can agree with that more with both of you. And the importance of reducing our carbon footprints individually, actually has co-benefits to our physical and mental health that we don't recognize enough. But just reducing our personal carbon footprints is not going to solve the problem. What we need is policy, national, global policy. And there also, I think what really helps is to talk about the co-benefits of the solutions to the root causes of the problem, the carbon dioxide emissions. If we're actually able to get a handle on that and reduce our demand for fossil fuels, then the co-benefits go from all the way up to the global scale, to national security and global security. Because imagine if the demand for fossil fuels is reduced, then these authoritarian petrol state countries like Russia and Iran are not going to be able to afford their pet projects, like aggressing their neighbors and messing with elections all over the world. And that's a co-benefit. And that's one of many, and we don't talk about that enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In addition to that, I think there's also, I try to convince my students that this is an opportunity, right? It's a business opportunity. It's an opportunity for innovation and advancement. Like, we did create a problem, but now there is innovation and creativity that needs to be brought in to help not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also try to take the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere out. And that is where we're seeing a lot of innovation. And there will be, there's so many brilliant young minds that are out there starting new startups every day that are coming up with creative ways of doing this. So rather than just viewing it as a problem that we created that, is horrible, which it is, but it's also an opportunity. And so I think kind of flipping the narrative a little bit makes it an exciting time, right? It's not just depressing. So
yeah, and that's a short-term part to the solution. It's sort of like the Band-Aid. Right. But if we only focus on those things and don't address the root causes, we don't get any of the co-benefits. Sure.
If you don't know what to do, you can just support organizations that are doing that sort of work.
Take a question from Dwight now.
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation. Question for Jennifer Campbell about kelp. On land-based plants, we've done so much genetic modification, and it's controversial. Is research being done on that in kelp, and is that in our future with kelp?
Controversial would be the name of the game. The only genetic modification, so California is incredibly conservative about doing any GMO in natural systems. And so the short answer is no, there's nothing happening in our environment. There are people that are doing a lot of novel genetic work with kelp. Like, for example, we just this year got the first full genome sequence of giant kelp, our queen of the seaweeds. And so prior to that, if you don't have the entire genome sequenced, you can't do anything. And so we're still just kind of at the very early stages of learning from that genome and understanding what we don't know if there are thermal tolerance genes and what we might want to manipulate. So I would say GMO is definitely not an area of active research. It's more perhaps selective breeding, where if we do find those thermally tolerant individuals, can we breed them with some of the less tolerant ones and slowly start building some temperature resilience into these populations so they're less horribly affected when we have warm water. But good question. Yeah, it's controversial, capital C.
Jim Smith here.
Hi. This might be for Anne, but how about this?
Okay, try now.
All right. This might be for Anne, but I believe that California has committed to 30 by 30, so 30% of land and sea in some kind of protective status. How does that relate to the marine protected areas? You had a bunch of little areas. It would seem 30% would be huge compared to what I saw in your diagrams, or maybe I'm missing that.
Another controversial question. No, this is great. Yes, so 30 by 30 is a statewide initiative, and it's a national initiative. So, in California, we really like to be at the tip of the spear for all conservation efforts throughout the country. And I was recently in Sacramento talking with some legislators about how we can continue to go on this path of 30 by 30 when the governor's budget for environmental protection was really drastically cut. So I'm not answering your question. I'll do that. The MPAs, depending on where they are and what part of the land or sea they're on, can count toward that. But it's you get a bunch of scientists in a room talking about policy, and we're trying to figure out the definition of what does conserve mean, and it just talks in circles. But to answer your question, yes, the MPA network is important for 30 by 30, and it's likely that a lot of that area will count towards 30 by 30. So hopefully we will still get there.
One over here.
All three speakers, fascinating insights. You gave a lot of food for thought and action, so thank you. If I may, two questions, one for Dr. Smith and one for Dr. Gershunov. Dr. Smith, if you could tell us a little bit about the carbon sequestration cycle with the kelp, right? I mean, how does it affect phytoplankton? How does it affect diatoms, right? So with the death of kelp, what is happening to sequestration? So if you could comment on that. And Dr. Gershunov, I really like the equation you gave. 1 degree gives you 7% increase in humidity. So the question is, do the oscillations start varying so much? What is the reason? Like, let's say we have climate change, temperature rise of 1.5 centigrade, right? So you will have 10%, 12% increase in humidity, right? But does that mean that you have these extreme events, these great oscillations? Just wanted to understand the reason behind this huge variability you're seeing.
Okay, I'll start. So carbon sequestration in the ocean is complex. It really depends on what organism and system you're talking about. So for example, in seagrass systems, as Anne mentioned, or mangrove systems, they're much more like terrestrial plants where they take in carbon dioxide from the water instead of the air. They fix it into sugars that get sequestered, deposited into the sediments and soils underneath them because they have true root systems. And when we say sequestration, when you're thinking about the whole real world of carbon credits and carbon offsets, that means that carbon has to be locked out of the atmosphere for up to 100 years. With seaweeds, even though our giant kelp grows up to 2 feet a day and is one of the fastest carbon fixers on the planet, what happens to that carbon is really variable. And because kelp don't have roots that are locked into sediment, they're just attached to the rock. So all their carbon is in their tissue. And so you could have a big swell and all the kelp could get ripped up and go onto the beach where it's just gonna get consumed and respired back into the air, back into the atmosphere. So that is not sequestered. This is another controversial area. A lot of people are very interested in doing kelp forest restoration as a form of carbon sequestration to potentially be able to sell offsets. The carbon offsets market is vastly, there's much more demand than there is offset products on the market, and so there's a lot of people interested in finding more potential solutions, but that's actually another project I could have talked for an hour about, that we're trying to develop a methodology for figuring out what happens to kelp carbon, and could it ever be considered sequestered. So we can talk later.
I heard kind of two questions in your question. One is about the variability, the extreme variability that we have from year to year in our total precipitation, right? Another one is about the basically the amount of water vapor that the atmosphere can hold as a function of temperature, and how that's related. Was that it? So, I mean, really, the variability is, our extreme hydroclimate variability is due to the fact that we have a very small sample size of storms that produce our total annual precipitation. I mean, we're in a Mediterranean climate. Most of our storms come in a narrow winter period. And so, the small sample size of storms, winter storms that produce our precipitation, is behind that extreme dependence on really heavy precipitation events on, of our total hydroclimate. And really that small sample of storms, statistically, small sample means large sampling variability. You can think of it that way. So, the year's precipitation depends a lot on that, 1, 2, 3, 4 really big events. And really whether we get an extreme weather, a drought year, depends on whether we get, the 2, 3, 4 big atmospheric rivers or not. And that's really the root cause of our extreme hydroclimate variability. But the other issue is how warming impacts those extremes. Basically, warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. That's called saturation vapor pressure. It's just the limit of how much water vapor in the gas phase can be held in the atmosphere depends mostly on temperature. And atmospheric rivers are the storms that are close to saturation. It doesn't mean that atmospheric moisture increases everywhere at all times, but it means that when it is close to saturation, close to 100% relative humidity, you get 7% more moisture per degree warming. Now, the interesting thing is, we've had about a degree or a little over that now of warming globally, and we would expect wetter atmospheric rivers, because it's really the mountains that squeeze moisture out of those atmospheric rivers. If there's more moisture in warmer atmospheric rivers and they slam against the same mountain range that's not moving anywhere on these time scales, more should rain out. And we're not seeing that yet in observations. We're fully expecting that to happen. And what's happening when we look closely at the observations is that the dynamics, the circulation, the winds are changing also in a way that's counteracting that thermodynamic effect of the warming. That's probably a natural phenomenon, a decadal type of variability that we need to understand better so that we can actually understand when that mode shifts phases, are we going to get an abrupt extreme, an abrupt increase in extreme events, or what? But for now, it means that these floods that we're having, we cannot definitively blame on climate change. And that's a really important point, I think, because I think everybody wants to blame these extreme flooding events on climate change, because then nobody is responsible for dealing with the consequences. You know, it's like all of humanity is responsible. That's not the case, actually, not yet anyways. And so I really want to get that point across.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank all three of you for absolutely fantastic presentations. I could compliment you for the next 10 minutes, but time is short. So I had a question for Professor Gershunov. Starting with your graph, starting with the pink dots on the East Coast, going to yellow and Midwest, and then red and blue, green and blue on the West Coast, I get the impression that the distribution of storms, frequency versus intensity, is not a bell-shaped curve, but it's more like a barbell-shaped, and that will be even more extreme as climate change increases. I also had a question. You had several graphs on ocean water temperature, but I didn't hear you mention about La Nina and El Nino, which, as you know, impacts our rainfall a lot in California. But since it also impacts, from my understanding, it impacts the jet stream, and so that also impacts hurricane season in the Atlantic. So I was wondering if you could comment on that and whether climate change is going to affect El Nino and La Nina cycles at all. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, hurricanes in the Atlantic do care about El Nino and La Nina events in the Pacific because they're actually impacted by one of the three ingredients that go into hurricane genesis storm genesis of hurricanes. You need warm water. You need to be, so it's warm water, which is usually a tropical phenomenon, condition, but you need to be away from the equator where there's Coriolis force that gives it that spin. And then the third thing is the wind speed, the wind shear with height. So as you go up, if the wind changes a lot, becomes much faster with height, the hurricane cannot develop. It cannot develop vertically. Its top just gets kind of sheared off and it doesn't have a chance. So those three ingredients, and it's the wind shear that's impacted by El Nino. The wind shear actually increases with El Nino effects, but in the Atlantic, right? So during El Nino years, the hurricane season is less active in the Atlantic. As far as our climate, it's much more directly impacted through the waves and basically the configuration of the jet stream. So that during El Nino, because the warm water migrates from the Western Pacific to the Central and Eastern Pacific, and that injection of heat, energy, moisture into the atmosphere basically shifts by a few thousand kilometers, that impacts the position of the jet stream, and that tends to send the storm track further south into Southern California during El Nino years, and further north into the Pacific Northwest during La Nina years. But it doesn't really guarantee that. And we've seen that last year, for example, that there was a La Nina year and all the forecasts were for a dry winter here, and we got one of the wettest winters on record. And actually, this century so far, some of the wettest years, we didn't get a lot of wet years. It's been very dry, so it's like drought, but punctuated by a wet year every now and then. Some of the wettest years, 2011, 2017, and 23, were all La Nina years. And they were all extremely active in terms of atmospheric rivers. Well, we're actually looking at this now with a postdoc that's working with me, and her name is Rosa Luna Nino, like Moonchild, and I couldn't wait to publish a paper with her on El Nino, and we're sort of revisiting this issue that I used to work on when I started working at Scripps in the late 90s. El Nino and La Nina impacts on our climate, and what we're seeing now, we're really looking at how El Nino, La Nina, ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, that variability in the tropical Pacific impacts different storm activities. So atmospheric rivers and other storms. And it turns out that other storms are very much impacted by El Nino and La Nina cycles, but atmospheric rivers don't dance to the tune of ENSO. And they can make or break a forecast, because when there is an El Nino going on or La Nina, the seasonal forecast it always looks like that canonical pattern, that average pattern that you statistically get from El Nino and La Nina years. But we haven't really seen those very often in this century. Something is changing with the way that ENSO impacts our region. And we're trying to get to the bottom of it. But one thing we do understand is that these are results that are going to be submitted next week for publication, is that atmospheric rivers are really the wild cards. We call those years, by the way, the years that are that don't follow the canonical El Nino and La Nina signals. Dry California during El Nino, and wet Pacific Northwest, for example, that's the canonical signal. We call those heretical years.
Hi, my name is Alice. I live in Del Mar, and something that's always missing in the conversation is climate change, the effect of the rising high tide and flooding on San Onofre, and the 800 tons of nuclear waste sitting 108 feet from the surf. My question to you is, are you doing any research on the billions of gallons of radioactive water released from San Onofre? There was one on May 6th. We just had another one. The effect that it would be on the water temperature, marine life, and humans.
Sorry, I don't know
I'd
much
like to
about
see
that.
this a part of the dialogue.
Yeah, I'm not doing any research specifically on San Onofre, although we do some sea level rise work, and I think most of you who do live in Del Mar know that all of our coastal ecosystems here, unless we're in an estuary, essentially abut coastal cliffs. And so my work is looking at the natural species that exist in, say, our intertidal ecosystems. If you have a meter of sea level rise, those rocky habitats are going to be completely submerged. So, the same thing is going to happen farther north. I'm not sure if anybody has any expertise about San Onofre in particular, but I do not.
I'd like to see that changed. I'd like to see UCSD and Scripps weigh in, make it a part of their research and dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, I could look into who does that kind of research and maybe suggest them as next year's speaker. Okay.
Next question.
Hi, Sasha. Back to precipitation. So you mentioned that the models uniformly predict less drizzle-type rain. And it's also been my observation that it seems like there's been less fog and drizzle over the last many decades here. And is that a climate signal, and what causes it in the models?
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, the models really predict less frequent sort of average intensity precipitation events. We don't get a heck of a lot of drizzle down here anyways, but as far as, but your question is really about low-level clouds and fog, right? And Rachel Clemesha, that works in our group, is a world expert on that. She did her PhD on marine layer clouds. Well, marine layer clouds are one of the most difficult, complicated features of our climate as far as how it's related to climate variability and change. And also, the forecasts of marine layer clouds are not that great. And part of the reason is that they're sensitive to so many different things on all kinds of different space and time scales, from the largest atmospheric circulation on the planet, and that's the Hadley cells, you know, that extreme convection around the meteorological equator, and then the air has to subside in the subtropics, basically, which is our climate during the summer. So, you know, around now, we get that subtropical subsidence. That dry air is subsiding and warming as it moves to, you know, higher pressure below. And then below it, we have marine air that's been sitting over a cool ocean. And the boundary between them is a temperature inversion, basically where temperature it increases between the cool, moist air below and the dry, warm air on top. You've all seen how marine layer clouds build from that inversion down. When you fly through, when you take off from here, during marine layer cloud episode, it's gray, and then you break through this cloud layer, and boom, all of a sudden, it's just major sunshine. And you can see how flat the top of the cloud is. Basically, that inversion is like a lid. It prevents air from rising above it, because air rises when it's warmer than the environment, but when it hits the inversion where temperature goes up, it sinks back down immediately. So we have this lid, and sometimes the clouds can actually build all the way down to the surface, or we can have a surface-based inversion, and that's fog. Or when that inversion runs into a mountainous coast, right, and you get fog. Well, there have been some observations of fog and low-level clouds being less dense and less persistent in some areas, and it seems that that's really related to urban warming. It's really observed around urban areas that have been growing. You know, so it's not necessarily a climate change signal, but, well, it's a human-caused signal, but more localized. That's my take on it. Yeah.
It's really short, but then we've got to wrap up here. We've got one more speaker tonight, so.
This is for Sasha. Sasha, thank you for delineating and telling us the complexities in the real attempt to model the climate system and how much uncertainty there is. But given that each year or each several years, you know, the IPCC goes through an elaborate procedure and comes up with some specific recommendations. 1.5 degrees is going to result in this. Does the fact that this is so probabilistic and statistical impact that in any way? How do we interpret those numbers?
Well, thanks, Al. I think IPCC comes up with those numbers as, you know, a target that's challenging and reasonable. You know, basically, any significant amount of warming changes our climate regime. And with so many people on the globe and the agriculture and our lives basically dependent on a stable climate, any amount of climate change will disrupt that. The question is, you know, how much disruption can we handle versus, you know, how much climate mitigation can we reasonably achieve? So, you know, they picked that number. It also has to do with the loss of ice around the globe too. So I'm not sure how to answer your question, but yeah, it does come down to a probabilistic argument.
All right, everyone, a big hand for our panel. Thank you all so much for taking questions from the audience this evening. We are going to welcome our final speaker to give us her closing remarks. Please welcome our CEO, or Chief Environmental Optimist, Mayela Manasjan. She's been involved in the city's sustainability board for several years. She is the executive director of Casa Huerma in Mexico, and she's just back from Dharamshala in India, where she was collaborating with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So please welcome Mayela.
Tonight, we're going to get in touch with our inner warrior. So thank you for sticking around this long. And you guys have already shown your warrior spirit staying out this late at night. So thank you, Jonathan. As he mentioned, I just returned from a visit with His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. And he's there giving me a little spiritual slap. He said, "You're doing a great job, but I know you can do better." So when I had the opportunity to meet with His Holiness, I was trying to think, like, what should I say? And I remember walking up to him, and as you can see in these photos, and I said, "Your Holiness, on behalf of all climate activists, I want to thank you for your commitment to protecting our precious planet. We are so appreciative of you." And he looked at me, and I looked back at him, and there was the longest silent pause I've ever experienced in my life. And I said, "Oh no, did I say something wrong?" And his translator then translated what I had just said to him into Tibetan. And he looked back at me and he said, with a smile on his face, "Environment, very good." And he threw his hands up. And that to me was everything, because I love hearing His Holiness's laugh. If you haven't heard it, look him up on YouTube. I'm sure there are videos of him just laughing. So from His Holiness to you, I want to tell you that he sends you all his love and appreciation. Another Buddhist teacher, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, once shared that because of all the distractions and trauma in the world these days, it's getting harder and harder to show up for the present moment and engage in our lives. Our culture tends to lull us into a sense of false security. We think that somehow life is going to get easier. It's like the idea of retirement. We work hard, and then there is a lull when we can flop and just let everything hang. The path of engagement does not get easier, and there is no retirement. But when we surrender to the reality that we have to keep showing up to make progress, and that being present takes effort, discipline, and dedication, we discover a sense of delight. With that said, there is no surprise that you are here tonight. You signed up for this long before the registration ever went out. You are answering a calling to serve, and as long as you are alive, you have a rare and precious opportunity to continue to do this work. Climate action is an act of love. We protect what we love, and when we do this, with the knowing that everything is interdependent, when we care for our planet, we are also caring for ourselves and for our children and all future generations. So it is important that we show up to show that we care. Now, if we want to solve our climate crisis, here are some of the things that you need to be thinking about. So as warriors in the world, I want to see you put your hearts up if you want the following. So this is how you're going to put your hearts up. All right, everybody get your hearts ready. Here we go. Okay. Hearts up if you want to build strong and resilient communities. Hearts up if you want to communicate and collaborate with stakeholders to take climate action. Hearts up if you want to advocate for policy changes and climate justice. Yes, let me take a picture of everybody with their hearts up here, all right. Okay, that's great. Hearts up if you want to find innovative solutions towards a net zero emissions future. All right. So all that sounds great, but how do we actually achieve these things? Now I'm going to share a super secret with all of you. This is your secret superpower. Are you ready? The best way to connect with people as it relates to our climate crisis, and I have tried and tested this all over the world, is to do it with compassion. There are 4 components to this. Openness, be open, be present, be in the moment. Be open to the person or the people that you're connecting with and their experiences and who they are and the conversation that you're about to engage in. Inquisitiveness. It's very important that we be curious about our own lives and what we're doing and the people that we're about to engage with. What common interests do you share with them? What do you hope to achieve out of your connection with them? Sensitivity. It's also important that we be sensitive to what is going on and what the other person may be experiencing. And lastly, vulnerability. This one involves touching into your tender heart and extending that feeling out towards others. So, who are we going to connect with? The answer is everybody. I always say, and this is maybe the Mexican side of me, that I make it my business to know everyone's business. Find your voice. Find the causes that you're passionate about. And start talking about them. Your voice matters. Talk to your friends, family, and encourage them. In my family, there are 3 generations of climate activists, from my 27-year-old daughter on up to my 80-year-old father. Encourage your children. Invite them to be a part of the solution. Raise your voice even louder. Express yourself on social media, attend climate marches, offer presentations about what you know. You can even start your own podcast. Mine is called Tiny Climate Challenge. The musician here in this photo just showed up. It's a very Mexican thing, and he played for the entire audience and they loved it. Create connections, find your tribe, or create your own if you don't find like-minded people. We happen to have one that we started with the founder here in the audience, Jim Wong, the Eco-Sustainability Peeps. Del Mar, we've talked about it. Do you know you have your own sustainability advisory board? Show up, speak out, get involved with local nonprofits like Wild Coast. Volunteer your time, attend their events. If you're really invested in their mission, ask to serve on their board. They're always looking for engaging board members or volunteers. If you don't have time, become a monthly donor. They will love you forever. Get politically active. Support candidates who believe in climate science and want to proactively do something about it. On May 31st, I'm flying back home to Mexico, where I've been living for the last 5 years. As a dual Mexican-American citizen, I will be voting for the first female president in Mexico on June 2nd. Support candidates who believe in climate science and want to proactively do something about it. And one of the most important things you can do that doesn't cost anything is vote. Use your voice, your vote, and your choice, as my good friend Al Gore says here. Political will is a renewable resource. And yes, I am also on the Todd squad. Lastly, celebrate. You want to have something to celebrate? You have to start taking concrete steps to achieve your goals today. We achieve our aspirations in the present moment. Think about that. If you want to achieve something tomorrow, you need to start doing it today. Today, in this present moment. I was shocked that things that I had worked on have come to fruition. Climate action plans, committed to 100% renewable energy here in Del Mar, and also in the city of Encinitas and many other cities across the country now. And community choice energy. I started campaigning for that in 2017. I asked to meet with Dwight Warden. He said, tell me about this. So I used my superpower. You can too. It works. Let it shine. When we develop confidence in our innate goodness, we sparkle with brightness and vitality, and people get excited about the things that you become passionate about. Commit to taking action. I'd like to ask all of you, think of something that you'd like to do, something more beyond what you're already doing, and start taking action. We need all hands on deck. As my good friend Jill McIntyre-Witt likes to say, we need everybody everywhere doing everything at all times. Tonight, you've heard from 3 incredible speakers about what you can do to get involved and make a difference. You have a rare and precious opportunity here, and I challenge each of you to commit to taking one tiny action for yourselves and your community. Del Mar, I love you. May you continue to give the world your good energy.